I was born. And so for my entire life I was surrounded by these teachings, by these masters, but it wasn't until much later that I decided to take it on as my own. And I spent 9 years in one of the first Education for Life schools, which I'll talk more about what makes an Education for Life school in Palo Alto. I was basically every year they expanded the school in order to fit me. So it was a very new school. When I started, I was in kindergarten, and then each year it got bigger as I got bigger in order to contain me and also my friends. And then I graduated 8th grade and went on to high school at a Catholic private school and a public university, which was my first introduction to real introduction to the world outside of Ananda and Education for Life. And I'll talk more about that. I'll also have time at the end for questions. Be happy to answer questions that you have and everything else that comes up. I am curious, I've talked to some of you, but just before we begin, by a show of hands, how many people here are involved in education, currently or previously? Administrative teaching, okay. How many here are parents or have had children, or even if they're not in the home? Yeah. And how many here are just curious about Swami and Master's philosophy on education? That's me. Although I'm not currently involved in education, but I was. So, first of all, because of Sri Yukteswar, and this is actually an interesting topic in India to get into, because in America we've never heard of the yugas, the cycles of time that sort of dictate where the consciousness of the planet is at that time. And it was not until I came here that I realized that it was somewhat controversial. But Sri Yukteswar, as most of you probably know, said that there was a mistake in the calculations for what was Kali Yuga, what was Dwapara Yuga. And that it is, my understanding, a prevailing belief, or at least that many people believe, that we're in Kali Yuga right now. But that Sri Yukteswar came and said, actually, in the year 1700, basically, we started our transition into Dwapara Yuga. And I start with this because, and in fact, if you look, for me it seems very clear, but this is also my only introduction, is from Sri Yukteswar. When I read his book, The Holy Science, I don't understand the science of it. I understand that it's there, and I understand where he's coming from. But what I really understand is the results. When I look around me, and I'm a big fan of studying history, when I see the results all around me and what the world looks like today, and when I look at the characteristics of Kali Yuga versus Dwapara Yuga, it's easier for me to understand and to believe that we may in fact be in Dwapara Yuga. You see from 1700 on, which is the time when Sri Yukteswar said that we started into the transition, you see the invention, the world just suddenly becomes very small. In the 200 years, 300 years, you go from not being able to communicate with anybody outside of where you're looking at, to being able to call people across the country, across the world. You can travel. We traveled here from America. We stopped in Italy, but the whole process only took, 20 hours, 15 hours, a journey that used to take months and months, and maybe years. And also just like the world is changing, and our old values we see it, because this is actually the challenge. We see a lot of things becoming good with technology, but we also see things looking maybe darker. We see politicians that are filled with anger. Particularly in America, there's a lot of acrimony right now between the different groups within the United States. And you see it in other countries too, and you see that there's this increasing tension. And on some level you have to wonder, why is there so much tension if we're moving into a higher age? It seems like we should be feeling more peace. But when you think about that we're moving from one system that has governed the planet for really thousands of years, 2,400 years, from the descending Kali into ascending Kali, moving into a whole new system of being, and you're having souls that are incarnating that are attracted to this system of being, this new uplifted, energetic way of living. There's going to be conflict. Kali Yuga was a time when power was consolidated and very few people had it, and Dwapara is an age where power is given to the people, and everyone discovers their own power and discovers that through using energy that they can change their circumstances. They're not stuck in one way of life forever. You're not stuck in one mentality forever. And so this is important because a lot of our system of education, this is why Master was so passionate about education. It was, as probably all of you know, who are familiar with Yoganandaji, the first thing he did as a service to humanity, not even teaching adults or going and giving talks all around the world as he did later on, was to start a school. He started Dihika school. And then later moved to Ranchi, and it was a very successful school. And it was because he was here, Yogananda was here, Swamiji called Yogananda the avatar of Dwapara Yuga, the singular soul that was brought to bring us from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga. And you can see the teachings that he brought are not in any way new, and yet at the same time they're completely revolutionary. They take the ancient teachings of India, the teachings of Christ, the teachings of Buddha, all of these ancient teachings that have become less and less understood over time, or were not able to be fully lived in a darker age, and brought them into the light. So now in Dwapara Yuga you have Master talking about being able to harness the power of the universe and make it your own, and being able to change yourself in an instant and destroy habits, and through Kriya Yoga and all sorts of other tools that he brought, being able to completely change the very nature of yourself in an instant, rather than the old model, which at the time was all we could do. Go out into the caves in the Himalayas or into a monastery far away from people and live away from people, away from influence. But that in Dwapara Yuga, we could be in the world and we could change the world. And it's really empowering, actually, when you think about it, that we're not, for so long we were told, we being the greater humanity, we were told that we would not be able to change our circumstances, that life was just this way. It was a way of keeping peasants peasants and kings kings. And if you were in power, you could convince people that they belonged there, that was the place they were supposed to be. You could keep them in bondage. And that's increasingly no longer the case. You see the democratization of everything. I mean, just look at the internet. Before, even just media had to come from only the wealthiest people, and they got to say what was made and what was done. Now you have someone on their phone making a web series that gets more views than someone who paid all of this money to get their thing broadcast on TV. So everything is changing. And one of the things education is supposed to do is prepare our children for their lives, right? I mean, the only purpose of having education, before there was standardized education, our children would learn in our house. They'd learn whatever trade we did, and then they'd carry on that trade because that was what they had access to. And then we got more evolved as a society, or at the very least, maybe not evolved, but we got more able to as production increases, then people are free to not have to work in the fields. They're able to go learn a trade or learn a skill. And so we're able to slowly build up things like the arts and the sciences and things that don't immediately pay off in terms of your family being able to eat this year, sort of thing. And so in Dwapara Yuga, we are now seeing that people have an incredible opportunity. Students have an incredible opportunity all around the world to become, how do I want to put this? To become to become what their soul is incarnated to be. And that is really what Education for Life comes from, what Master's teaching comes from. When we first started education, we looked back into Kali principles and we said, okay, they're going to need to know certain things. They're going to need to know math. They're going to need to know maybe some science. They're going to need to know how to read and write. And all of that is true, right? We need those are critical tools for what we do every day. I find myself, my students, I taught also, I forgot to mention, in the Ananda Living Wisdom High School in Ananda Village for 4 years. And so my students, I taught math amongst many other subjects. And my students would ask me, why do I need math? Like, why can't I just not learn math? Which, if you're in education, is probably a question you fielded about something. Or even as a parent, why do I need to know this? This is not going to help me. And I find myself using math every single day. Like when I'm here, I'm constantly dividing every number by 70 so I can figure out how much money I'm actually spending. But I mean, even when you're shopping, you're doing this, there's little things we don't always think about what makes an entire person a person. And so Master wanted to change what it is we think of when we think about success. Because education, at the end of the day, is meant to make our children successful. We want our children to be more successful than we've been even. We want to set them on a path that's going to be even more fulfilling than the one that we have. Because no greater love is there than that of a parent or of a master for their children. And so, but he brought a change that allowed us to see, or tried to help us to see, that we have for a long time defined success, thank you, in terms of the material, because Kali Yuga is a material age, and so we've defined success in terms of how much money we're going to make, how big our house is, how easily we're able to pay our bills, are we able to afford a nice car? And it doesn't always have to be the nicest things. These are very real things. We need shelter, we need food, we need a sense of security. These are basic human needs, and they always will be. But Master, because the age was changing to Dwapara Yuga, foresaw that we now are going to have energy free to seek things like true happiness, fulfillment, peace, consideration, understanding, the qualities that we all are seeking on the spiritual path. Many of us, most of us, maybe all of us, came to the spiritual path when we were adults. I even grew up in Ananda, and I still had to go through the suffering of finding my way on my own before I came back to Ananda. In fact, I didn't find Ananda until I came back to India, or came to India. So I grew up in Ananda. I had my parents, my dad is a light bearer. He gives Sunday service in Palo Alto. I mean, I had very easy access to these teachings. But you're not ready until you're ready. And so it wasn't until I came here when I was 22 after college that I actually found these things and was able to really grasp them. So sometimes education is also about preparing our students to learn. A lot of what I feel like I did in high school was not teach my students the things I was teaching them, but teaching them instead how to learn. Because the world right now is changing so rapidly. When we try to prepare students for the jobs of today, those jobs are gone by the time they go to find a job. There's a big push right now for coding, especially where I'm from in the Silicon Valley, Palo Alto. It's just every job is coding. And that's definitely true, that will help you find a very particular type of job. But by the time that the student is an adult and ready to find a job, coding might happen on an entirely different plane. The world is changing. Instead of, it used to be every 100 years there was a major shift, every 50 years. Now it's every 5 years, every year, a new technology comes out that completely changes everything that we think we know about the world. And so if we prepare them only with the tools that we have now, they're going to be lacking in their skills on some level. They're going to have to figure it out when they're there. And so education for life, what Master envisioned and what Swamiji envisioned when he wrote the book Education for Life, which I highly recommend to anyone interested in the subject. It goes into incredible depths on this subject that it's just an amazing book. It's also a very accessible read. But what they foresaw was that if we could train our students how to learn, not what to learn, that if we then put them into the situation, into the time when they're ready to learn themselves, they will be able to pick it up. In fact, I have here a list. I just want to pull it up. Because Mountain View, where I live in Palo Alto, is actually the global headquarters of Google. And as I grew up, I just thought I'd get bigger and bigger and more important until I'd read world news and they'd be saying Mountain View. I'm like, Mountain View, that's my town. Because Google has just become such an integral part of everything that we do. And in America, Google is also held up, maybe it is here too, as the gold standard in terms of workplace, in terms of they're on the cutting edge of all things human resources, about how to to find the right people and the recruitment. They get something like, I think it was 2 million job applications every year, and they only hire 4,000 people, which, thank you so much. She knows me well. Only 4,000, which makes it more exclusive than even the best schools in the world, just because of the raw desire to work for Google and be a part of something that big. But I want to read some of the things they've asked they have a person in charge of their hiring practices. He's a vice president of human resources or something. They had a cooler name because it's Google for it. And some of the things that they look for when they're looking for the thing. The first thing is, the thing I find the most interesting is GPA is a non-factor in success. In America we call it GPA. It's your average of grades, grade point average. So you take all of your grades and they each get a numerical value, you add them up, and it gives you an idea of if you got a 4.0, you got all A's. If you have a 3.0, you averaged all B's, and so on. I also apologize, I'm not as familiar with the Indian system, so if at any point I say something that just makes no sense, please call me out on it and I can translate. But basically it's just a way of describing how someone's doing academically. And in terms of their work and also tests and everything else, it's conglomerated into one number. And in fact, nowadays, because it's become so competitive in the United States, you can take advanced placement courses, which means that an A is actually worth 5 points. So what used to be a perfect GPA, 4.0, is now like a good GPA. But you can get like a 4.1, a 4.2, 4.3, and really like raise the bar. If you take all AP classes, I guess you could get a 5.0, but I don't know if that's actually possible.
Yeah.
Is it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh. Incidentally, we also have then separately the SAT, which is a test that maybe you've heard of. After high school, you take it in order to get into college. And one of the fellow students in my school, in high school, actually got a perfect score on the SAT and then a perfect score on 2 other national standardized tests and made like the national news. But what Google has found in their experience is that GPA, purely academic success, is not an indicator of how well someone is going to do at Google. Why would that be? Because we're sure that if we just learn all of the things that are set in front of us, we can become successful when those things come to us in the real world. And it's not false. The impulse is a good one. We want to do the best we can to prepare ourselves. The problem is that when you only focus on academics, you're only focusing on a narrow aspect of what it is to be actually an employee. Even think in your own jobs. How exclusively are you using the things that you learned in school? Or how much of it is how you work in a team? You work with your people in your office. How well you accept direction. How well you accept criticism. Things like that. And so they found, they track all of these things. Google is all about data, their data as well as your data. And that's a privacy joke. And they were able to see that some people have excellent GPAs and some people have okay GPAs, but it wasn't an indicator. Not to say that someone couldn't be successful and have a high GPA, but it didn't seem to matter. So when they were looking for people, they stopped asking for GPA. Role-related knowledge. So this is the knowledge that is actually more general rather than specific, because they found that when people had a very specific knowledge, say they knew one particular type of coding, that was fine, but when they ran into a challenge, something that they weren't expecting, that they weren't equipped necessarily with how to overpass it, because it wasn't something that had come to them in their academic training. It didn't come in the book. So they didn't as much know how to get around it. Whereas if people had maybe not a complete understanding of that one part of coding, but sort of understood like computers, technology, even just life itself, they were able to find, that's not going to fall. They were able to find, is it going to fall?
Oh, yeah. Maybe he did.
Here, so I thought if just by saying it I could will it not to happen. But maybe that's not true. Thank you so much. But having a general, wider view of like the whole problem allowed them to pick it up from different sides. So this may not give you the answer, but something over here you might actually be able to cut across and solve the problem in a way that's unexpected. That's Google's whole philosophy, and it's not exclusive to Google, but we use Google because they're the standard bearer. But being able to problem solve from a different angle. It's also one of the reasons that they look for diversity. And not just diversity in terms of your culture, having this many people from this place and this many people from that place, this many men, this many women, but having diversity of life experience. And this is really important because when you have people who went through exclusively intense academic training, their experience is very similar. Because just by nature of education, because of the size that we have to have for classes, because of just the number of children that there are, a lot of times we have to make things more and more the same in order to make sure that everybody gets a chance, which is it's a really positive reason for it. But the problem is that all people are different. You know nobody who is exactly like you. And you know no two people who are exactly like. Even twins are different. They look similar, but when you talk to them, one likes this, one likes this. And so when Google has found that by finding people who have a wide range of life experiences, maybe they've traveled, maybe they've gone and done service someplace, maybe the list is infinite, actually, just in terms of making sure that there's a diversity in the experiences so that when something comes up, when there's a challenge, one of the people in this team will be like, wait a second, I know this one. I've seen something like this. I was in Cambodia and I was doing this, and we can actually just do that. Whereas if everyone comes from the exact same experience, you're really good in this one area, but as soon as something comes that is different from that, it can knock you off the rails. One of the other big things is something they call emergent leadership. Now, emergent leadership is the ability to step forward as a leader when it is needed, but to step backwards when you're no longer needed to be in that role. So a lot of times we think of leadership, and this is something that I think Swamiji wrote a book, The Art of Supportive Leadership, which is another book that I highly recommend. It's actually used by the United States Army in their training of officers. Excuse me. And basically the idea, it's an extremely deep philosophy, but the whole thing can at least, the beginning of it can be summarized in leaders are here to serve. They're not here to be leaders. And this is a hard thing because when we see great leaders, it looks like they're standing at the top of the rock with their hair blowing in the wind, like leading the charge, and they were like waving the flag, and everyone's like, this guy, but in slow motion because it's like a movie. But in actuality, the most effective leaders are people who empower others to do the things that they're good at. So they're people who are almost the best leaders often fade into the background. You don't even know that they're leading at all. And this is something that is not, it's hard to train, actually, leadership. If you think there are institutes where you can go, but in most schools, leadership as itself is not, it's hard to have a class just on leadership because it's something that's more intuitive. And we'll get into why that would be important in a second. I just have one more of these that I want to list, and then I'll explain why I'm listing all these things. And that's humility. And what they've found, I actually just found an article that came out yesterday on this same subject. What they found is that, and this is also maybe a cultural thing, so maybe this won't ring as true for you, but in America, we are very afraid culturally of letting people know that we made a mistake. It's for some people it may be pride, for others it may be fear. You may be afraid you'll lose your job, you might be afraid people won't like you, so we don't always want to immediately admit mistakes. And the problem with that, and this is like the core of education for life, is that if you do not make mistakes, you will never learn what not to do. And we know this also in our own lives, spiritually. If we don't, if we have a regular meditation practice and it's really helping us, and then we drop it for a day, we can feel the difference. And we don't say, the old model was to throw yourself at the mercy of your altar and just pray that Guru wasn't watching that day and that God doesn't know that you weren't meditating. And if you're Catholic, maybe you have your whip and you're, flagellating yourself. But the thing is, if we don't have that experience of what it felt like to not have meditated that day or whatever it is, that good thing, eat a proper breakfast, the list is infinite, we won't know how much we need it. And so even in my own life, I find that I have to keep learning and refining lessons over and over and over again. But it's because of those mistakes that I am now so sure in the things that I really know. The things in my life that I can point to and say, that is something that I am sure of, is because of the times that I made mistakes. And that brings us to education for life. So Swamiji, one moment. Well, Master actually wrote something called a psychological chart. I don't know has anyone ever seen this? It's a very fascinating document. I don't have the simplified version with me right now, but basically it's a way of assessing where you are and a way of directing yourself to becoming better in those areas. So you find the things that you really are deficient in, and sometimes it takes help. At his school, they used it in the Ranchi school. The teachers, 2 or 3 teachers, would each get together and talk about one of the students and agree on where they were on this chart. But basically, what I like about it is that it looks at life as a spectrum. So you start in one place and you're moving here. So if you're right here, your next step is right here. But if you're right here, your next step isn't necessarily there. It's over here. But these 2 students might be in the same classroom. And so what Master was able to do, in fact, in part, of course, because he was a realized being, was basically, in his case, he was basically reading the student from the inside out and knowing exactly what they need when they need it. Swamiji also had that skill, though he never taught children. He had the ability for all of us to just sort of see what it is we needed, and if we were ready to hear it, he would tell us. And that's one of the key things that makes education for life different, is it is a student-centered, not education-centered curriculum, if you want to say. And so basically, at all times, an EFL teacher is asking, what does this student need? How can I serve this student? And that's a challenging thing to do because it requires constant awareness, which doesn't mean that all of us are always able to meet that bar, but the intention for an EFL teacher is, what does this student need? And I actually want to write down a couple things on the board. This is something that, this comes from the psychological chart. It comes from Swamiji's teachings on the subject, and you may recognize it as coming from somewhere else, but I'm not going to tell you until I'm done. So basically, this is the spectrum of basically of energy. Because we are in Dwapara Yuga, we're now able to recognize energy as the motivator behind all actions. And so instead of working exclusively with behaviors, or even with behaviors first, we are trained to work with energy first. Everything is on the energy level. So there's heavy energy, there's ego active, and then there's light. So basically, and actually ego active, there's sort of a middle ground in between these. So basically, excuse me, heavy energy is exactly what it sounds like. It's energy that doesn't want to get up out of the chair, that doesn't want to do stuff, that isn't interested. This is how sometimes we feel that last morning of the work week when we've been going every day. We've been waking up at 6 and it's raining outside and my leg hurts and I'm hungry and I want to go. That's heavy energy. And we've all probably seen it in ourselves, although we don't have to admit it right now. But we've definitely seen it in children, right? The heavy energy. This is the energy that says no. And whether or not it says it verbally or just in terms of body language, if you were to see heavy, it would be this. I mean, actually, that I'd even be standing is almost a victory, because I really should just be a puddle on the floor. That's heavy. Ego active is the next step up. Now, on the spiritual path, we see ego and we're like, wait a second, I thought ego was bad or the enemy. But the problem is that without ego, we can't actually change. On the spiritual path, we actually know that we need to use ego in order to transcend ego. At the end of the Mahabharata, the ego has to actually willfully give himself up in order to actually die. Bhishma has the boon that he has to choose to die. And in fact gives a really beautiful speech about Dharma as he's going, because the ego is the tool, it's our main tool in spiritual progress. So too for children. Now, ego active can go in two different ways. It can be ego active heavy, which is sort of just like a middle ground here on the spectrum, which is, it's more energetic, but it's still in the consciousness of no. It wants to reject, it wants everything to be different, it wants you to go away. But it's got energy, so maybe it's throwing a pillow at you. I don't know how it is here. But ego active is the spark. It has a little bit more force. Then ego active light is the same idea. They're still interested in themselves. They're motivated principally by self-interest, egoic interest, but they're now willing to put out this energy towards a more positive goal. And so setting goals or saying let's go do something, let's run, let's move the energy. This is something that you hear a lot in an EFL classroom. Let's move the energy, let's change the energy. Or if you don't hear it outside, you're hearing it in the teacher's head. They're saying, I see what's happening here. We are heading down the spectrum. We gotta do something to move this up. And I'll give you some ideas in a second. And then light is the same. It's everything that heavy isn't. It's you're upbeat, you're alive. Swamiji used to love pointing out that all of our language, at least in English, about uplifted energy is when you feel light, you feel high, you feel lighter than air, you feel, even your head points up, your chest opens up, like your body responds to this light energy. And you can see, I mean, kids are great because they show it so completely on their bodies that you don't even need to really ask them, how are you doing? How was school today? How was school today? It was great! But if they hadn't said anything, you would have known. So, I don't know, but do you, by chance recognize something from ancient
Sattvic, Rajasic,
Anji. Yeah, and I'm not gonna write them because I actually don't know how to spell them. But this is, well, I know I would know how to spell them in front of an American audience, but I'm a little more nervous in front of an audience that really knows, because they wouldn't know. But exactly, so you're talking about tamas, rajas, and sattva. Master famously said, this is one of the first quotes I heard of his, and I loved it, was, give me an evil person over someone who has no energy. Because at least with the evil person I can do something. So that's this section. This is the evil, quote unquote evil person. But the evil person is able to manifest things. The evil person is able to make things happen in the material world.
The manifestation seems to be very good.
Which one?
For the evil person, their manifestation seems to be very good, like you're saying.
Right, I mean they're able to, like, if you think of the most famous evil people in the world, they
whatever
accomplish
they
a
want,
lot.
they do get it.
Exactly, yeah. The evil King Ravana had a palace, had the wife, had everything, up until at the very end something went wrong. I think he died. But, you know, he had the stuff. If you think about the most evil people, if you're heavy, you don't have enough energy to become evil. Like, you couldn't be famous as a heavy person. You're stuck on the floor of your house. Or, like, you know, you're just watching maybe TV all day or whatever it is for you. But to get up to here is actually spiritually a step forward for them. And so when you have truly heavy energy, I remember when I first met Swamiji, I actually, before I became a teacher, I spent 3 years traveling with him as his videographer. And for a brief period, I actually lived with him in his house because he had taken a fall and he wasn't able to walk. And so they needed someone large, and I'm large. So I got to be there with him. And I remember in that time in Los Angeles, I was very new on the path. I just started meditating. Everything was still very difficult for me. I was a little prone to, you know, moods or what have you. And I remember one day I was in a really heavy place. And I didn't do this because of Education for Life, but at the same time I totally did it because of Education for Life. Because the genius of EFL is that it happens usually, especially for younger children, on a completely unconscious level. They don't know why they're choosing the things they're doing, but you're training them so that when they get to a heavy thing, they go for a run. So what I did is I went for a run. But I didn't just go for any run. I went for a run listening to my favorite rock album from high school, which was the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I don't know if you're familiar. They are not a sattvic group. They're very nice, they're very talented, but they're not sattvic. This cannot be said about them. But because I was in a heavy place, that's what I wanted, that's what I needed, in fact, because that was enough to get me out of the, oh, life's not fair, oh, I'm sad, whatever it is. It pushed me up a level. Another time, I went for a run and I was more in the ego active. I just wanted to go for a run. I was like, oh, you know what was really nice that other time? Red Hot Chili Peppers. I'm going to listen to them. But I was up here, and so it sent me into a tailspin. And I actually ended up like really depressed afterwards. I was like, but why? I did the thing that worked before, and now it's not working. Why is that? Because we have to be always aware of the spectrum, that where we are on the spectrum, and then do the things that are going to take us to the next step. Of course, not counting light, because when you are pure sattva, it doesn't matter. You're already in the light. But anywhere in here, you want to pick the thing that's above you. And so for each of the students, this is the challenging thing about having a classroom where you don't have control over how students come in the morning, or even how your child wakes up in the morning. You don't know how they're going to be. They could be in a really good mood. They could be down here. And so the same things aren't going to work if they're here as if they're here. If they're here, you know, you might have a nice conversation about the day, or talk about, depending on their interests or whatever things, that they may even want to talk about your interests if they're up here. If they're down here, if they want to talk at all, they only want to talk about themselves, their interests, and maybe about how everything's terrible. Now, heavy is not the most common, and in fact, light's not the most common. This is generally where we operate. But when you have a group of students coming in, and I was very blessed, we had 17 people in our school at the time. That was from 7th standard up to 12th. So not a lot of people. And in a particular classroom, because it was such a wide range, I would only have a fraction of that. So I would usually have 5 or 6 students. So when they came in, I was able to really just take the time to be like, heavy, ego light, light, heavy, in my head also. Although, actually, I did find, not here, but right here, that making fun of them and how they were sitting actually worked really well. If they were really heavy, they would take it personally and they would get upset by it. But if they were here, I could say something like, oh, is that really bad? And then they would laugh and they'd actually come up to here. Or something like that. It's good-natured, hopefully. But also sometimes I'd be like, come on, get with it. We're like doing a thing here. Everyone else is light. What are you doing here? So this has been an incredibly helpful tool. And this is something, one thing I also like about Education for Life is that it's taking the spiritual path and putting it into really one of its most accessible forms. It's taking the principles that we all do, the meditation and the introspection, all of those things, and making it in a way that's really easy to access. And so as part of EFL training, you learn about these are called oh man, my brain. I actually have a handout of these that I can give you. But basically, it's basically progressive development. That's the core part of Education for Life, is progressive development. The idea that wherever you are, you're just trying to move forward. And so when I have a class, let's take an example. When I have a class of a lot of light, or we call it ego active light, kids, and then one heavy kid, what would be the instinct of most people? Who would you focus on? Possibly the heavier kid, because you see them and they need help and you want to help them. And this was actually a mistake I made a lot when I first started teaching, because you see them, you know you can help them, but when you focus on this energy, it actually brings all of these kids down. And so, anytime I say kids, you can also just substitute mental citizens, because this is what happens in ourselves. When we're having a negative thought in a field of positive thoughts, and we focus on the negative thought, the whole field becomes negative. Everything starts to be brought down here, because whatever we give energy to grows. That's just the nature. It's why we concentrate on the spiritual eye. If we direct our energy there, energy will go there. and it'll start to grow and become bigger, and it'll become actually like a magnet, and it will draw all the energy in our form to that point. The same is true for a group of children. If you focus on the heavy or the low energy, you actually will bring everyone else down, and you won't really get them. I spent whole class periods, even days, like pushing a kid up a hill trying to get them happy, but in the process, I didn't give the light kids who had come what they needed, which was more light, and I actually sacrificed some of my own light in the process. A lot of teaching in a school, or really in any school, or also just really a lot of life, is about magnetism. The magnetism of the teacher is basically everything, and what energy you go into the classroom with will decide what kind of day you have. I'd like to just pass this out. We won't go through the whole thing, or I'll take one and pass it. Yeah, if you could, that would be great. This is just a handy sheet for the kinds of behaviors that you can look for in yourself, in your child, in the classroom, based on the different ranges. So you'll see at the top it says heavy, egoactive light, and light. So this is the spectrum from heavy to light. And then over here on the left, when you get it, you'll see the types of things. These are just like categories, if you will. And once everyone has, or most people have, I'd like to just go through a couple of them to really like drive home the point so that we can understand it fully before moving on. And I also want to make sure that I leave time for questions. So, responses to great people. So actually, before we even go into the examples, let's look at the top one, which is heavy, the different stages of progressive development. So the heavy one is undeveloped or contractive. So that's actually a nice way to think about it. When we talk about energy, Swamiji and Master talked a lot about expansive versus contractive. So if light isn't quite connecting for you, think about expansive. Think about helping others and thinking of others, and really like expansive energy, and contractive being the closest to self. It actually would even work as like you could have like this is the you, and then like it goes bigger and more out, reaching out towards the world as you go. So on the first one you have, no energy of others' needs. That's down here. Then egoactive heavy, you're more self-involved. So you're able to raise the energy a little bit, but it's for you. This is where the evil people come in, or really just the megalomaniacs, the egotists, the President of the United States, or whatever. Just as an example. So they have energy, but their awareness is still very small. As we move to egoactive light, they actively want to get better. And this really describes these two categories, just to be honest. They're like overall the majority of the students I ever got to teach. I was very blessed in that. This is where they came from because they were attracted to a school that taught these sorts of things, and so really I was usually working with here. Only once in a while do we dip into the lower ones, like us all. And they have growing awareness. And then light, of course, expansive, inclusive, energy plus awareness, basically trying to include others in the reality. You'll see a light kid see an egoactive heavy or heavy kid, and their first thought is, I want to help that person. I want to go, so you'll see them go and comfort them. More times than not, we really rely on our light kids to help the kids who weren't doing as well, because they had the energy and magnetism built up over the years of doing the things that we do in school in order to pull other people up with them. So I wasn't having to take the whole class into this area, but a light child would go over to a child that wasn't feeling well and comfort them and sit with them and laugh with them or get them to laugh, which was always really amazing. Let's just look at the first one, and then you can look through this later on your own if you like. The response to great people. So the heavy energy is intimidated by greatness. So it's not necessarily a rejection. Like it's a rejection in that the light is too bright and I can't even look at it. It will blind me. I have to go over here. I found this also with with Swamiji when he would come to visit the school. I mean, he was the epitome of light, and the children were all going straight to Swamiji. They all were going straight to him. It was the parents that actually had more reservations about like, who is this guy? I don't want to deal with him. What's he doing over there? Because the kids had been doing all of these things to raise their energy, like meditation, like yoga, like energization exercises, all the things from our path that we use, these tools, we give to the children because, of course, like they actually can pick it up just as easily. And so when they saw light, they went straight for it. But people who hadn't been having that same experience were a little bit more hesitant. They weren't maybe heavy, but they were a little more wary. And so then you see an ego-active heavy, disrespectful and competitive. So now you have the energy to be disrespectful, because that takes some energy to go up to someone and like talk back to them or say something rude or something like that. But if they were completely heavy, they wouldn't be able to do that at all. Then ego-active light, they become more observant, questioning. So they're like, well, why do you look like you're so happy? Why do you look so great? Well, how have you been able to do the things that you do? There's a natural curiosity because the energy is there, and now they're tending a little bit towards light, so they can see that there's light, and they want to know more about it. And there's even a thought, maybe I could become this if I put out the energy. And the last being, if you're truly light and you see someone who's light, you just feel inspiration. And that was why all of our light kids were attracted to someone like Swami. Or when somebody came in, we also, in the years of our school, we visited different countries. One time our college got to visit with the Dalai Lama. We visited spiritual teachers and had them come in and talk. And the kids are remarkably receptive, especially for the age that we live in. So I'll let you, if you like, to go through the rest on your own, because there's a question.
I have a question on this. So someone might be ego-active light, but in certain aspects, like for example, decision making can be functioning from a different, say, ego-active heavy or
In fact. So yeah, because you have your whole energy, but then individually in your life, you have your different life skills, the things that you're able to do. I actually have a list of those here, but decision making is a great one. You're good in all these other areas and you're not as good in this area. So then it's a matter of helping them see that they can take this energy they have in other areas and move it in. But the great thing about this spectrum is it gives you a roadmap for how to work with individual things. So if they're truly heavy in decision making, you don't try to get them all the way to light in one day. You take them to one thing. So if heavy decision making for me is standing in front of the chocolate for like an hour, not being able to decide, and then leaving without chocolate. That would be, you're so heavy and unable to decide that you can't even make a decision. So ego-active heavy would be just buy something, just whatever it is, just close your eyes and grab something and go, just so that they can get the feeling of moving the energy and buying it, even if it's the worst thing and they end up hating it. They've at least done something. Ego-active light would be like, okay, now that you've had, especially because this is progressive, now that you've had this bad experience, you ate the chocolate bar that was all raisins and no chocolate, now you know that there are some choices that are better than other choices, but you can still make them. It didn't kill you to make a choice and make a wrong choice. You can make a mistake and bounce back. The chocolate metaphor is wearing a little thin right now because it's not nearly as important to some. But so now we're going to take a little more time and really refine. But maybe they're still taking a while at this point, but they pick something that they like. And then at light, really, when you're light in an area, you've developed what we call intuition to the point where you don't have to sit there thinking about it. You just pick something, and depending on where you're at, either your guru is picking it through you, and so it doesn't matter, or you just know that it doesn't matter. You pick the thing that you do your best to make a right decision, and then you move on and you live with the consequences. And as they get lighter and lighter, they'll find that they start making the right decisions.
What I've also noticed is that besides the fact that yes, we could be functioning from a certain different qualities, but it is also situational on where they are. If it's related to school, it'll be different, but if it's related to going out with friends, it'll be different.
In fact.
So that is also different.
Yes.
And so decision making maybe in school is better than when they go out with friends.
Sure. Oh, right. So maybe they're making, depending on their situation, of course. So this brings me to another one of Master's favorite quotes, which is, environment is stronger than willpower. And so a lot of it it's harder in the elementary level for different reasons to sort of communicate these things and train, but by the time they're in the high school level, I found that they are more and more receptive. As you get their energy higher and higher at school, even if it doesn't stay the same when they go out with friends or in the home if it's high, you're able to bring things up. And just our job as educators, I believe, and as parents, as everything, is simply to help our children to become aware. Because we can't make their decisions for them. Like at the end of the day, we can make some and we can try, especially when they're younger, we have to. That's our responsibility, is to sort of put them in the right direction. But as they get older, eventually they're going to be out of the house, out of our lives, and they're going to have to make these own decisions. And so one of the things we really try to do in high school is to start getting them to make their own decisions now and feeling the result.
Yes.
And also just making them aware. Like our students, we had a very close relationship with our students because it was a small school, and also we lived at Ananda Village. Many of the students lived in the village, so we'd see them around the community. And we also would take trips with them for 2 weeks to other countries, and we just had a very close relationship. And so we were able to bring up things that were like, hey, you did that thing the last weekend, and they would just tell us like, oh, this thing, and it didn't really work out. I was like, yeah, you should watch that. Like, that friend may not be the best influence on you, but like, not, you shouldn't go see that friend, because if they're coming to you and telling you this, they're already moving light, and if you come in with a heavy proclamation, that's going to send them down. Whereas if you say, yeah, you should pay attention to how you feel around certain people, because you actually have the ability to choose your environment. You actually can choose which friends you're going to spend time with. It's not decided for you.
And everyone, I would say, contributes something different to their lives.
In fact,
it's not going to be the same with everyone.
Exactly, and it's because somebody is, like a friend is going through challenges, and maybe even some like hard challenges, sometimes the appropriate response is to be in their life and to really be with them and help them. And sometimes it's to let them have their time to sort out their things and then come back when they're ready for help. And that's the whole thing, is when they get to a certain point of lightness, you can train them to help, to look for these things, to look for the same things in other people. What is it, heavy energy? How do you work with it? Can you work with it? What is light energy? If you see this in your friend, if you see a real openness or awareness, then maybe you can help them. But otherwise, it's knowing when to fight and when to fly. Fight or flight is actually a surprisingly good spiritual principle, because Master said, bite off more than you can chew and chew it. But he also said, if you know you're going to lose, it's your spiritual responsibility to run. I will tackle this mountain later, because if I tackle it now, it will actually hurt me more than if I just push through and try to do everything that comes to me. So it's a wide spectrum. It's as wide as the spiritual path. But that is what we're basically training. We're training children to be prepared spiritually to handle the world that they will run into. And in truth, we know, I mean, our school in particular was modeled after the Gurukul system, with the teachers being involved in both the academic training but also the spiritual training of the students. In our high school, we would meditate or do yoga every morning. We would do kirtan once a week. I taught, basically spirituality came into every class that I taught at some point. It's just a part of the fabric. And it's not our spirituality. I didn't talk a lot about Master. I didn't talk a lot about Swamiji, although of course they came up because they're my teachers. But just giving them the core spiritual feeling, because children in a lot of ways are the most receptive. It's the best time to get on the spiritual path, because you actually, when you sit and meditate when you're 7, you have experiences of God. I remember I went to a Shiva Ratri when I was a young child, and I stayed up all night, and I remember seeing yellow light, and to this day that's the only time that I've had that experience. And because you're just so close, you just come from the astral world, and it's like, of course, it's the material world that slowly over time convinces us that these things aren't real, that these things don't have value. And so if you can put those things in a way that's accessible and is real to them, at an early age, but completely non-attached, because the attachment can drive it down into heavy. But if we keep at light, we're able to, when you're light, you can see light in everything. And so you'll know what your path is. And so you're deciding between two jobs, or between two majors, or between two partners, or should I marry, should I not, should I become a, I mean, all these different things. We're constantly beset with decisions. That's the main challenge of being a human, I think, is that we're constantly having to decide things. And if you have been trained, whether consciously or unconsciously, as a child to become light, that whole aspect of life as a challenge is removed. And you're able to just move through. And so you still have challenges, still things come to you, but you're perceiving it from a different level. And so that's where I still have students, they grumbled so much about having to meditate in the morning. They would complain so much about having to do yoga in the morning. Many of those students are still meditating now, or still will be like, oh, I meditated the other day, it was really nice. Or I was having, I mean, it's amazing what they'll come in and say, oh yeah, I was feeling really sad, so I went out and energized. It's like, I don't even do that. That's amazing. Because it's obvious. You're giving them tools that they can use right now to change their consciousness. And they aren't at the point yet where their world is so built that they can't add new things. Everything is new and they're sponges. They're just pulling things and trying them. Kids are scientists. They try things, and if it works, it's there. And it's locked in. And so it's the perfect time to give spiritual teaching in a way that's completely natural with the flow. I've gone past my time, and I want to respect that. So I'm happy to take questions. I'm also happy to talk with people a little bit more afterwards, but I want to at least give people the opportunity to depart. Or not. There's one other thing that I would like to just talk a little bit about, and please feel free to leave in the middle if you do have to go. But there's the tools of maturity. And this is one of the unique contributions that Master made. And actually, I was talking to somebody. I can't remember now. They will alert me. Who taught at Aurobindo's school?
Oh, she is there.
Oh, she left. Okay,
Yeah.
So good. I felt so bad. Like I just spoke with her. But basically, I'm going to erase this one. I'll just do a brief overview of the tools of maturity, because it can be. This is the more, so what we talked about right now is the more, I mean, everything is spiritual. There's the more overtly spiritual aspect of education for life. This is a little bit more practical. So what Swamiji tuned into, and other systems of education have also tuned into, is that there are natural cycles to human development. And I mean, this is also psychologists, and basically if you have raised a child, you see. When they're very young, they're one way. As they get older, they're a different way. Some things are caused by physical changes, like puberty. Some things are just the timing of things and how things work in your life. But basically, there's four main categories. The body years. So these are the first 6 years. Let's say 0 to 6. First 6 years of a child's life. And this is when, as we've all seen, everything has to do with the body. First of all, they're just learning how to use their body. When they're first born, there's just no sense at all. So you're not going to try to teach them deep philosophy like Sarcha when they're like a baby. It just wouldn't make sense. So there's a timing to things. As they get older, they're grabbing everything. They're wanting to touch everything. They're reaching out to the world. Even when a baby is just born, you sometimes see their first action is to reach out. I think my dad told me a story that I grabbed his finger when I was really, really young, and that was a really big moment in his life. But I was, as a soul, I'm trying to understand the world around me. Master said when he incarnated, he heard all languages simultaneously, and then as he came into the world, he singled out Bengali as the language that was being spoken around him. And there's okay, I'm in Bengal, I have to speak Bengali. So we're basically figuring out who it is we're supposed to be, but in a physical way. So even by 6, you're able to run and walk and jump and everything. You're putting things in your mouth, you're rubbing yourself with dirt, whatever it is. But everything happens through the body. And it doesn't end here. I should be clear from the outset. It doesn't mean you don't learn with your body after 6, but this is the principal tool of maturity, or basically the principal way to teach someone when they're 0 to 6. So you see a lot of we do things like I'm awake and ready, I'm awake and ready, super conscious living exercises. We do with young children because they love it. It's moving the body and it makes sense to them. Next comes the feeling years. And that would be, I guess, 7 to 12, the next 6-year pattern. Swamiji, in his book, Education for Life, when he talks about these, he introduces them in the context of the fact that Jupiter is making 12-year cycles, and that essentially what's happening is Jupiter is farthest away and then returning, and farthest away and then returning in these cycles. But we also see, like this 7 to 12, children are more perceptive of what's going on in their heart. They're able to feel things rather than only perceiving them through touch. Their consciousness has raised to the point where they're able to feel them. The things really can upset them, but also they can be extremely joyful. Song, dance, the arts are a really important thing with feeling years and also with feeling children, because it's something where they're able to express themselves in a way, because they're, at 7 to 12, your primary skill is not usually like being able to articulate yourself necessarily. You don't know all the words you want to say and you're not ready for that stage yet. So for feeling there's, like I said, arts and song, it's all heart-based, you can even start training intuition at this point. You can start becoming a little bit more aware, saying, how did that make you feel? And especially when you're resolving conflict between students, well, how did that make you feel? And then when people by this age hear how the other person was feeling, a lot of times that's enough to make them want to change their behavior, because they didn't realize, they hadn't expanded to the point where they realized how everyone else was feeling. They had just done something. And once they know that hurt my feelings, then things actually can shift fairly easily. Einstein said, this I like, the essence of true discovery is a sense of mystical awe. Basically, Einstein said that in training, the feeling years is important for later, because to be a truly successful anything, but even scientists, this is why we always use the scientific examples, because science is the one field where we think, well, feeling doesn't matter. In fact, feeling is bad. You don't want to have feelings, because if you're doing a scientific experiment, you can't let your feelings get in the way. You'll break the experiment. And that's true if you're talking, on one level, if you're talking about emotion. But Swamiji describes feeling as actually the calming of emotions. It's the heart quality when emotions have been calmed to the point that you can actually directly perceive through intuition the answer. And so great scientists, Einstein being one of them, talked about how important, Nikola Tesla also, about how important feeling was to their process. And Einstein, when he came up with his general theory of relativity, he didn't figure it out. It came to him in a flash as direct inspiration, and he felt it. And then he spent years figuring out, how does this actually work? And he was able to prove it. But E equals MC squared came to him in a flash, and he was like, that's it. I feel it. That's right. So from 7 to 12, that's the principal method of teaching. So in that time, doing a lot of things in that area, in general, can be really helpful. Now, here's where we get to my expertise. I'm just going to say will. Oh yeah, that would be 13, 18. So these are the teenage years. And I think you probably could have already guessed that was going to be, will would be the teenage years. This is the year where we start experimenting with imposing our will. We're like, wait a second, if I will something, I can make it happen. And it's not always a good thing. And then they're also just using will indiscriminately sometimes. That's like the generic stereotype about the teenagers, that they're just like, if you want them to do it, they don't want to do it. If you don't want them to do it, they do want to do it. Everything is opposite, everything's upside down, but they do it with total energy. They're not doing it halfway at all. So the thing about will and working with the will years is they want to be challenged. That's why they're responding in this way. They want challenge. They're looking for it. And they will get it however they can, which will be challenging the parents in this case. Oh, and I don't know, it's working for me. And, or challenging authority or challenging everything. But that's a good thing, because if you then give them that challenge, then they're able to respond with that same energy, but in a positive way. So they were heavy, or ego acted heavy when they were challenging everything around them. But when you give them a challenge that will take them in the right direction, that will actually help them move towards light. We did service adventure trips at our high school, and we'd go all across the world, and we separated the boys and the girls, because at that age, the way they experience will can be very different, and it's good to give them opportunities in safe spaces to sort of challenge will in their own way. And for the guys, a lot of their challenging of will can come in a very physical way. But it's actually a trick, because it's actually to let them get into their feeling. Because sometimes, especially in the American society, feeling is not associated with the masculine. It's associated with the feminine. Body is associated with the masculine. So we would go and do challenges, like we went to a freezing waterfall. I mean, really, it was like coming off of an ice pack. And the guys all dunked their heads inside. They took off their shirts and they dunked themselves into this freezing water. And they tried to not respond. It didn't really work, because they were like bright red, and it was really shocking. So they would really shock themselves and prove that they could do it. But in that process, I found that they also, once they showed that they could do it physically, they were also more comfortable addressing the feeling side, the feelings that they were having about things. And in those trips, we actually were able to go much deeper with them than really all through the year. It was one of the most amazing parts about those trips, is because they were built all around challenge for an age group that wanted challenge desperately. We also, like with the boys, we backpacked in the Himalayas in Nepal. Once we went to Hong Kong, different cultures, different languages, different experiences, all designed to give both a challenge to the will, but also just a broader awareness of what's out there. We found, travel, for those who can, is an excellent way of getting the experience of expanded awareness. And then the last part I'll just touch on briefly is the intellect. And the intellect, we usually say 19 to 24, but we keep growing throughout our lives. And the intellect is where we're finally ready to learn specifically intellectual things, but things that, because we've developed all of these things first, the body has helped our like the idea of yoga is so that you can achieve perfect asana, right? So you're able to sit still and like be totally absorbed in the infinite. The feeling is that you can also feel that state. The will is that it takes great determination to be able to do that. And so when you've developed these three first, intellect is able to take you much farther, because you're able to not just learn, oh, Sartre said this, and then Jung said this, and because of those two things, I'm right. Like, you can logic your way through things, but if you're able to actually feel, Swamiji said when he saw works of great literature, he was able to feel light coming from them when he was younger. He wrote a whole paper in college about how he could feel that the Iliad was a great book, even though he didn't personally like it, because he could feel a white light coming from it. And that other books of philosophy that are supposedly well thought of, is supposed to be very like high literature, he saw like a murky brownish light, and that's how he knew that they weren't high. Now that's not going to be the same for all of us. I haven't seen light coming from books lately. But when I read a book, with my intellect can say, oh, this is interesting, this sounds intelligent, there's big words in here. And I can will myself through it, but I don't feel like this isn't connecting with me on a heart level, and so I can put it down. All of these things work together in order to create a whole person who's able to then go out into the world and accept challenge in a dynamic way. And any imbalance in here, if you ignore the body, your body will give you trouble, you'll be in pain, you can't concentrate when you're in pain. If you ignore feeling, you can go around with a strong body because of your willpower, you're able to work out and you'll be able to know many things, but the world is cold and you can't feel it, and you end up not living a satisfying life. It's very hard to be happy without developing some of the feeling. And so all of these things are things that we all have, and then we all have them in different proportions.
you can probably look at these things and sort of think about your own life and reflect and think, okay, I'm actually like, will is my strongest quality. And so then what you can do, even in your life, and this is what we do for the students, is translate whatever's in front of them to be dynamically linked to their strengths. So when they're like, I don't know how to do this, if they're a feeling child, we'll take them in a feeling direction. Why don't you sit and like feel that, or even like get some paint out and just like start by painting or drawing, just to get things moving. If they're will, we might say, you know, there's a brute force, just like sit until you have the answer. Don't move. Like say you're just gonna like the challenges they used to do in all around the world of like standing on one foot for as long as you can. We do things like that because it activates the energy. It gets the energy moving. Body, go for a run. Go do some push-ups. Go for a swim. Go jump up and down or move your body in some way because it shakes loose the other energies. Intellect, go do some research. Read a book. Read something that inspires you. Because education is so much. The challenge with it is that so many children are stressed out by the intensity of what education has become in some ways, and scientifically, it's almost impossible for us to learn when we are stressed. The body just won't store long-term memories in the brain if we are undergoing stress. And so a lot of this is about finding the way to enjoy the process. And so when you figure out what your tools are, the ways that you can, your unique way of learning and navigating the world, you're able to find ways that are always, even if they're challenging, they're fun. And when it's fun, your brain just wants more, and it'll just latch onto it, and it'll learn everything. I've now gone way over my time, so I'm going to end there. If you have any people can really leave this time, but I'm also happy to stay and answer questions. Thank you very much.